When we packed up our lives and moved to Silverdale, I told myself it was the right choice. Hannah and I had talked about it for months, weighing the pros and cons of leaving our small-town roots behind for a new start. Her excitement had been contagious, and eventually, it overpowered my hesitations. "This is going to be good for us," she'd said, her green eyes sparkling with hope. A chance to build something new. And she wasn't wrong. On paper, it was the logical choice. I'd landed a higher-paying job at a manufacturing firm. The boys were young enough to adapt easily to a new school, and Silverdale was close enough to our hometown that visits wouldn't be a hassle. But the real selling point for Hannah was her uncle, Roy. Roy had been a big figure in Hannah's life for as long as I'd known her. As a kid, he'd been the uncle who stepped in after her dad passed away, helping her mom when things got tough and taking Hannah fishing or to ball games. As an adult, Roy was still her go-to for advice and support. When he heard we were moving to Silverdale, he was thrilled. "I'll help you get settled," he'd said. "Anything you need, just let me know." At the time, I'd been grateful for his offer. Moving was stressful enough, and having someone in the city who knew their way around was a relief. Roy was friendly and charismatic, the kind of guy who could make anyone feel at ease. He worked as a patrol sergeant for the Silverdale Police Department, a job he took pride in, and his reputation as a stand-up cop preceded him. I respected him, admired him even. It never crossed my mind to feel anything else. The first few weeks in Silverdale were a whirlwind. Between unpacking boxes, setting up utilities, and settling the kids into their new routines, Hannah and I barely had time to catch our breath. Roy came by often, usually with coffee or groceries, and helped with whatever needed doing. He and Hannah had an easy rapport, slipping into their familiar banter as if no time had passed since her childhood. I liked seeing her happy, laughing and relaxed. It made the chaos of the move feel worth it. Still, there were moments when I felt like an outsider. Hannah and Roy shared a history I wasn't part of, a shorthand in their conversations that sometimes left me struggling to keep up. I chalked it up to my own insecurities. Moving had left me a little off balance, and I was still adjusting to my new job. There was no reason to feel uneasy about their closeness. Or so I told myself. It was a Friday night when the incident happened. I was driving home late after staying at work to finish a quarterly report. The streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the only person awake in the world. I was tired, distracted, and in my rush to get home, I missed a stop sign at an intersection near an elementary school. The red and blue lights flashed behind me before I'd even realized what I'd done. I cursed under my breath as I pulled over, rolling down the window as the officer approached. He wasn't much older than me, clean-shaven and serious. "License and registration, please," he said, shining his flashlight into the car. "Of course," I said, fumbling for my wallet. I didn't realize I'd missed the sign. "Sorry about that." The officer didn't respond, his expression unreadable as he took my information and headed back to his cruiser. A few minutes later, he returned, his face even grimmer. "Mr. Jenkins, it appears there's an issue with your driver's license." "What kind of issue?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "It's suspended," he said. "You're not supposed to be driving." I stared at him, stunned. "That's a mistake. I didn't know." "Whether you knew or not, it's a serious offense," he interrupted. "I'm going to have to take you in." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I knew it, I was sitting in the back of a squad car, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I managed to convince the officer to let me call Hannah. "Mark," she answered, her voice groggy. "What's going on?" "I'm being arrested," I said, my voice flat. "What?" she exclaimed, her tone shifting to panic. "Why?" I explained the situation as best I could, though I was still piecing it together myself. "Can you call Roy?" I asked. "Maybe he can help." "Of course," she said quickly. "I'll call him right now." Roy showed up at the station an hour later, his presence filling the room the way it always did. "Mark," he said, shaking his head as he approached my holding cell. "What the hell happened?" I explained the situation again, my frustration spilling out in a rush of words. Roy listened, nodding occasionally, his expression calm but firm. "All right," he said when I finished. "We'll get this sorted out. But for now, you're going to have to stay here." It's standard procedure. For how long? I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. A few days, he said. Maybe a week. I'll do what I can to expedite things, but the law's the law. I didn't have much of a choice. Over the next few days, I sat in that cell, the hours dragging by in an endless cycle of boredom and frustration. Roy checked in on me occasionally, offering updates and reassurances. Don't worry about Hannah, he said. I'll keep an eye on her. I was grateful. The thought of her being alone in a new city while I was stuck here ate at me, and knowing Roy was there to help put my mind at ease. Thanks, I said. I appreciate it. Anything for family, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. By the time I was released, I was exhausted but relieved. I just wanted to go home, see Hannah and the boys, and put the whole mess behind me. When I walked through the front door, Hannah greeted me with a hug that felt warm but brief, like she was holding something back. I'm so glad you're home, she said, her voice soft. Me too, I said, kissing her forehead. How are the boys? They're fine, she said quickly. They've missed you. There was something in her tone that made me pause, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to the stress of the past week. I miss them too, I said, heading upstairs to see them. Over the next few days, I settled back into our routine, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But there was a distance between Hannah and me that I couldn't ignore. She seemed distracted, her phone always within reach but rarely out of her hand. When I asked her about it, she'd smile and say, just work stuff. Roy stopped by a few times, always with a smile and a friendly joke. He talked about how much time he'd spent with Hannah while I was gone, helping her with errands and keeping her company. At first, I was grateful, but the more he talked, the more a nagging suspicion began to creep in. One evening, while Hannah was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced at it, intending to ignore it, but the name on the screen stopped me cold. Roy. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, the message preview taunting me. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. The message stayed on the screen like a neon sign, mocking me. My hand trembled as I picked up the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. The words etched themselves into my mind, each syllable carving a deeper wound. For a moment, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I misread it. Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. But deep down, I knew better. My instincts had been screaming at me for days, and now, here it was, confirmation, staring me in the face. I swiped the screen to unlock the phone. Hannah had never been one to password protect her device, something I'd once considered a sign of her openness. Now, it felt like the cruelest irony. The text thread between Hannah and Roy unfolded in front of me, each message more damning than the last. Flirty banter gave way to explicit confessions, descriptions of stolen moments that made me want to throw the phone across the room. You drive me crazy, Hannah. I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was worth the risk. I've never felt this alive. I'll drop by tomorrow when Mark's at work. Can't wait to see you. I clenched the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My pulse roared in my ears, and my chest felt like it was about to explode. My wife, the woman I'd trusted with everything, and her own uncle were carrying on an affair under my roof. While I sat in a jail cell, they'd been sneaking around, laughing at my ignorance. The betrayal wasn't just a knife to the back. It was a twisting, unrelenting dagger. I barely registered the sound of the water turning off upstairs. My mind raced with questions, with fury. How long had this been going on? How could she do this to me? To our family? I shoved the phone back onto the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, gripping my hair with both hands as the bathroom door opened. Mark. Hannah's voice called softly. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a towel, her damp hair clinging to her shoulders. Her face lit up when she saw me, but her smile faltered when she noticed my expression. What's wrong? I looked at her, trying to keep my voice steady. Who's been texting you? She froze, her eyes darting toward the nightstand where her phone sat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice light but forced. You know exactly what I mean, I said, standing. Roy. He just texted you. Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. Care to explain? Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Mark, How long? I snapped, cutting her off. My voice was rising, but I didn't care. How long has this been going on? Her hands trembled as she clutched the towel tighter around herself. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice weak. Don't lie to me, Hannah. I shouted, my anger boiling over. I read the messages. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. She crumpled at the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her voice muffled. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I stared at her, my chest heaving. Go this far? I repeated, my voice shaking. You didn't mean for it to go this far? What the hell does that mean, Hannah? You didn't mean to sleep with him? You didn't mean to destroy our family? She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. Mark, I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I didn't know how to stop. It just happened. No, I said, stepping back. It didn't just happen. You made a choice. Over and over again. You chose him. Your uncle, Hannah. How could you? Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The betrayal was too raw, too deep. I turned away, pacing the room as I tried to process what she just admitted. The memories of Roy's visits, his easy charm, his offers to help, it all made me sick now. Every time he'd looked me in the eye, shaken my hand, joked with me about sports, he'd been lying. Does he love you? I asked suddenly, my voice low. What? She asked, looking up in confusion. Roy, I said, turning to face her. Does he love you? Is that what this is about? Some twisted romance? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. It was just an escape. I was lonely, Mark. You were always working, and I felt invisible. Invisible? I repeated, my voice rising again. So you slept with the first man who gave you attention? Do you have any idea what you've done? She didn't answer, her sobs growing louder. I clenched my fists, trying to rein in the rage threatening to consume me. You've destroyed everything, I said, my voice cracking. Our trust, our family. What am I supposed to tell the boys? What am I supposed to do now? I'll fix it, she said desperately. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. Please, don't give up on us. I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me wanted to throw her out, to tell her to pack her things and leave. But another part, the part that still loved her, despite everything, couldn't bring myself to say the words. I don't know if I can do this, I said finally, my voice hollow. I don't know if I can forgive you. Her face crumpled, but I couldn't look at her anymore. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Where are you going? She called after me. Out, I said shortly. Don't wait up. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, but it did little to clear my head. I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, my mind replaying the night's events in an endless loop. Every smile, every kiss, every moment I'd shared with Hannah now felt tainted, overshadowed by her betrayal. When I finally returned home, the house was dark and quiet. Hannah had fallen asleep on the couch, her face streaked with dried tears. I stood in the doorway, watching her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and confusion. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the confrontation was suffocating. The house felt smaller, darker, as though the walls were pressing in on me. Hannah was still asleep on the couch when I came downstairs. Her tear-streaked face and restless murmurs should have moved me, but all I felt was a cold, hollow ache in my chest. I poured a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the street. The kids were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just outside their doors. For their sake, I needed to keep it that way. No matter what happened next, their lives couldn't be collateral damage. Hannah stirred as I finished my coffee, sitting up slowly, her movements sluggish. When she saw me, her eyes filled with fresh tears. Mark, she said softly, her voice hoarse from crying. Can we talk? I set the mug down and crossed my arms. Talk, I said flatly. She hesitated, her hands trembling in her lap. I don't even know where to start, she admitted. I don't know what came over me. That's convenient, I said bitterly. You didn't seem confused in those messages. You seemed pretty sure of what you were doing. Her face crumpled, but I didn't stop. The anger bubbling inside me refused to be silenced. How long has it been going on? I demanded. How many times did you meet him while I was stuck in that damn cell? It wasn't like that, she said quickly, shaking her head. We didn't. We weren't physical until… Don't lie to me, I shouted, slamming my hand on the counter. I read the texts, Hannah. I know exactly what you were doing. Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I've destroyed everything. You're damn right you have, I said coldly. And for what? What could he possibly give you that I couldn't? Her silence was deafening. I left the house before the kids woke up, grabbing my keys and heading out without a word. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to escape. The city felt alien to me now, the streets and buildings tainted by what I'd learned. Everywhere I went, I saw reminders of the life I thought I had, a life that had turned out to be a lie. I ended up at a park on the outskirts of town, the one Roy had taken the kids to the week before. I parked the car and sat there for what felt like hours, my thoughts a tangled mess. Images of Roy and Hannah together flashed through my mind, each one more vivid and painful than the last. The betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was a violation of trust so deep, so insidious, that I didn't know if I'd ever recover. Roy wasn't just some stranger. He was family. He was supposed to protect us, not destroy us. When I returned home, the kids were up and eating breakfast. Dylan looked up from his cereal as I walked in. Hey, Dad, he said through a mouthful of food. Where'd you go? Just needed some air, I said, forcing a smile. What's on the agenda today? He shrugged. I've got soccer practice at 10. Coach says we're working on defense drills. Sounds good, I said, ruffling his hair as I walked past. Ella was busy coloring at the kitchen table, her focus so intense she didn't even notice me. For a brief moment, the normalcy of the scene eased the weight in my chest. But then I saw Hannah, standing by the sink, her face pale and drawn. She met my eyes for a second before looking away, guilt written all over her features. We didn't speak again until that evening, after the kids had gone to bed. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels aimlessly, when she walked in. She stood there for a moment, fidgeting nervously, before sitting down across from me. Mark, she began, her voice tentative. I know you don't want to hear this, but I need to say it. I didn't respond. I kept my eyes on the TV, pretending to be engrossed in a documentary about wild horses. I made a mistake, she said, her voice breaking. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. But I need you to know that it didn't mean anything. It wasn't about love, or about you. It was… I don't even know how to explain it. Then don't, I said sharply, turning to face her. Don't try to explain it. Don't try to justify it. Just tell me why. Why would you do this? Why would you risk everything we've built? Her eyes filled with tears. I was lonely, she admitted. After the move, with you working so much, I felt like I didn't matter anymore. And Roy, he made me feel seen. Seen, I repeated, my voice bitter. You felt unseen, so you slept with my wife? That's what we're calling it now. She flinched but didn't argue. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But I want to fix this, Mark. I want to fix us. I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I don't know if that's possible, I said finally. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you and not see this. Her sobs filled the room again, but I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. Not yet. That night, I slept in the guest room. Lying there in the unfamiliar bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind. The laughter, the love, the promises we'd made. They all felt like distant memories, overshadowed by her betrayal. When I finally drifted off to sleep, it was with the same question running through my mind. What now? The next few days were a blur of routine and silence. I buried myself in the small tasks of daily life, taking the kids to school, focusing on work, and spending as much time out of the house as I could. Hannah tried to talk to me a few times, but her words felt hollow, like they couldn't bridge the gaping chasm between us. The kids noticed, of course. Dylan was old enough to pick up on the tension, though he didn't say anything outright. Ella, on the other hand, was more vocal. "Why are you and Mom so quiet?" she asked one evening as I helped her with a school project. "We're just tired," I said, forcing a smile. "Moving has been a lot for everyone." She nodded, satisfied for the moment, and returned to her coloring. But the guilt gnawed at me. No matter how much I wanted to shield them from the fallout, I couldn't shake the feeling that they deserved better than this. One evening, while Hannah was upstairs putting the kids to bed, I sat in the living room with my laptop, staring at a blank search bar. I wasn't sure what I was looking for: guidance, answers, maybe just someone else's story that could make me feel less alone. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed, "What to do after discovering infidelity." The results were overwhelming. Articles about rebuilding trust, stories of people who stayed, and just as many stories of those who didn't. I clicked on a few, skimming the advice and personal accounts. The ones about reconciliation struck a nerve. Could I forgive Hannah? Could I ever look at her the same way? And then there was Roy. The very thought of him made my stomach churn. Hannah came downstairs as I was closing the laptop. She paused in the doorway, her eyes searching mine. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I sighed, leaning back in the chair. "Fine." She sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap. "I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry, Mark. I know I've hurt you in a way that might never be fixed, but I want to try. I want to make this right." I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess. "How do you make this right, Hannah?" I asked, my voice low. "You slept with your uncle, someone we both trusted, someone I trusted." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I know," she said, "and I hate myself for it. But I love you, Mark. I love our family, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix what I've broken." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what they meant. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she was telling the truth. But trust didn't come easily anymore. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts raced, memories of our life together mixing with the bitterness of her betrayal. I thought about the kids, about how much they adored Hannah, and about what it would mean to tear our family apart. Divorce wasn't something I'd ever imagined for us, but now it loomed over me like a shadow. I thought about Roy too, about his smug grin and easy charm. I replayed every interaction we'd had since moving to Silverdale, every time he'd stepped foot in our house while I was locked away. The anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. By the time the sun rose, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living in limbo. Something had to change. The next morning, I told Hannah I needed space. "I'm not saying I'm leaving," I said, "but I can't keep doing this. I need time to think." She nodded, her expression a mixture of sadness and relief. "I understand," she said. "Take whatever time you need." I packed a bag and checked into a small motel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, a basic room with a lumpy bed and a TV that barely worked, but it was quiet, and it gave me the distance I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The days at the motel were a mix of introspection and avoidance. I spent hours walking around Silverdale, revisiting places that had once felt new and exciting, but now carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I thought about calling my brother back in our hometown, but the idea of explaining what had happened was too humiliating. Instead, I spent my evenings scrolling through forums and articles, reading about other people's experiences with infidelity. Some stories mirrored mine so closely it felt like I was reading my own life. Others were so different they made me wonder if reconciliation was even possible. One thread stuck with me. A man who'd rebuilt his marriage after discovering his wife's affair had written, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward. But that choice has to be mutual. You can't do it alone." I closed the laptop and stared out the window, the man's words echoing in my mind. Was I ready to make that choice? And more importantly, was Hannah? I returned home after a week, unsure of what to expect. Hannah greeted me at the door, her expression cautious but hopeful. "How are you?" she asked. "Tired," I said honestly, "but ready to talk." We sat down in the living room, the kids safely occupied upstairs. For the first time since the confrontation, we laid everything on the table. Hannah admitted to the full extent of her affair with Roy, sparing no detail. It was painful to hear, but necessary. I asked questions I didn't even know I had, trying to make sense of how we'd gotten to this point. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice trembling, "but I need you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make this work. Counseling, therapy, anything. I just want us to have a chance." I nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "I'll think about it," I said, "but this isn't something I can decide overnight." The days that followed my return home felt like walking through a minefield. Every interaction with Hannah was tense, each conversation a delicate balancing act between civility and the unspoken betrayal that hung over us. The kids, thankfully, remained blissfully unaware of the storm raging beneath the surface, but their innocence only made the situation feel heavier. They deserved better than the fragile truce their parents were clinging to. Hannah kept her word about wanting to fix things. She found a marriage counselor and scheduled an appointment without consulting me, leaving the details on the kitchen counter with a note. "I'll be there if you want to come." It wasn't pushy, but it was a clear invitation, a way for her to show she was willing to do the work. I stared at the note for a long time, debating whether to go. Part of me wanted to refuse, to make her suffer the way she'd made me suffer. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I fell in love with, wanted answers. Not excuses, not justifications. Just clarity. When the day of the appointment arrived, I found myself walking into the office almost against my will. Hannah was already there, sitting stiffly in the waiting room. She glanced up when I walked in, her face a mixture of surprise and relief. "Mark," she said softly, standing. "Don't," I said, holding up a hand. "Let's just get this over with." Dr. Whitaker, the counselor, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a steady demeanor. She welcomed us into her office with a warmth that immediately made me uneasy. This wasn't going to be a warm and fuzzy conversation, and I didn't want to pretend otherwise. The first session was brutal. Dr. Whitaker didn't shy away from the hard questions, and neither did I. I demanded to know why Hannah had let it happen, how she could justify betraying me in such a profound way. Hannah's answers were raw, halting, and often painful to hear. "I was lonely," she said at one point, tears streaming down her face. "I felt invisible, like I was just existing. And Roy, he paid attention to me. He made me feel wanted. And I didn't." I shot back, my voice rising. "I married you, Hannah. I built a life with you. Was that not enough?" "It was," she said quickly. "It is. But somewhere along the way, I started to lose myself. I don't blame you, Mark. I blame me." By the end of the session, I was emotionally drained. Dr. Whitaker encouraged us to continue, to use the sessions as a safe space to explore what went wrong and whether we could rebuild. I agreed to come back, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was for the kids. Maybe it was for me. Or maybe, deep down, I still wanted to believe there was something worth saving. In the days that followed, I found myself grappling with conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, bubbling beneath the surface, but so was a sense of longing. For the life we'd built, for the woman I thought I knew. I hated Roy with a fiery intensity, but my feelings toward Hannah were more complicated. She had betrayed me, yes, but she was also the mother of my children, my partner in everything that had come before this nightmare. I decided to confront Roy. I called him one afternoon while Hannah was at work, and the kids were at school. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. There was a pause on the other end. "Mark, I don't think that's a good idea." "I don't care what you think," I snapped. "You owe me answers, Roy. You owe me the truth." He sighed. "Fine. Meet me at the diner on Main Street in an hour." The sight of him sitting in the booth, sipping coffee like nothing had happened, made my blood boil. I slid into the seat across from him, my jaw clenched. "You're a real piece of work. You know that?" I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Mark." "Don't," I interrupted. "You don't get to explain yourself. I just want to know one thing. Why?" Why would you do this to me? To your own niece? He set the coffee cup down, his expression grim. I don't have a good answer for you, he admitted. I messed up. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I crossed a line I never should have crossed. That's it? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. That's all you've got? I messed up? He looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I'm sorry, Mark. I know that doesn't mean much, but I am. Sorry doesn't cut it, I said sharply. You've destroyed my family. You've destroyed Hannah. And for what? A few cheap thrills? He didn't respond, and the silence between us was deafening. Finally, I stood, throwing a few bills on the table for my coffee. Stay away from us, I said, my voice low and firm. If I ever see you near my family again, I'll make sure you regret it. When I got home, I felt a strange sense of closure. Roy was out of our lives, but the scars he'd left behind weren't going to heal overnight. Hannah was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and drawn. How did it go? She asked softly. I shook my head. He's sorry, I said bitterly, but it doesn't change anything. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Mark, don't, I said, cutting her off. Just give me time. The weeks that followed were filled with tension and a growing sense of inevitability. Therapy sessions helped us talk about the pain, the betrayal, and the choices that had brought us here, but they didn't erase what had been done. No matter how many sessions we attended or how much effort Hannah put into repairing our relationship, something inside me remained broken. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, we sat in silence on opposite ends of the couch. The air between us was heavy, thick with words left unsaid. Finally, I broke the silence. Hannah, I said, my voice low, I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything. She turned to me, her eyes brimming with hope and fear. And I don't think I can do this anymore, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I've tried. I really have. But every time I look at you, all I can see is what you did, what we've lost. Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mark, please, she whispered. I know I hurt you. I know I've destroyed your trust, but I love you. I love our family. Isn't that worth fighting for? I shook my head, my chest tightening with the weight of my decision. I love you too, Hannah, but sometimes love isn't enough. You made a choice, and that choice has consequences. I can't keep pretending that things will ever go back to the way they were. We sat there for a long time, the silence broken only by her quiet sobs. What about the kids? She asked finally, her voice trembling. How do we tell them? We'll figure it out, I said, though the thought of explaining this to Dylan and Ella made my stomach churn. We'll do it together. They deserve the truth, at least the parts they can understand. She nodded, wiping her tears. I'll do whatever it takes to make this as easy as possible for them, she said. They shouldn't have to suffer because of my mistakes. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. We sat the kids down and explained, as gently as we could, that we were separating. Dylan was quiet, his jaw tight as he processed the news, while Ella burst into tears, begging us to stay together. I held her as she cried, my heart breaking all over again. Hannah and I worked out the logistics of splitting our lives. She would stay in the house with the kids while I found an apartment nearby. We agreed to co-parent, to prioritize the kids' well-being above all else. It was messy and painful, but it was the right thing to do. Moving out was surreal. Packing up my things felt like erasing myself from the life we'd built together. As I loaded the last box into the car, Hannah stood on the porch, watching me with tear-filled eyes. I'm sorry, she said softly, her voice trembling. For everything. I know, I said, my voice heavy. I'm sorry too. She nodded, wiping her cheeks. I hope you find happiness, Mark. You deserve it. You too, I said, though the words felt hollow. Then I got in the car and drove away, leaving behind the house, the memories, and the woman I once thought I'd spend forever with. The weeks after the move were lonely, but they were also liberating in a strange way. My apartment was small and bare, but it was mine, a space where I could breathe and begin to piece myself back together. I focused on the kids, throwing myself into being the best father I could be. Every weekend, I took them on hikes, to the movies, or to their favorite pizza place, creating new memories that were ours alone. Hannah and I maintained a civil relationship for the sake of the kids, but our conversations were brief and to the point. Over time, the anger I felt toward her began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She was no longer my wife, no longer the woman I'd built my life around. She was simply Hannah, the mother of my children and someone I had once loved deeply. A year later, I found myself back at the park where I'd confronted Roy. The trees were bare, their branches etched against the gray sky, and the playground was empty. I sat on a bench, thinking about everything that had happened since that day. The pain, the loss, the rebuilding. I wasn't the same person I'd been before the betrayal. I was stronger, more self-aware, and finally at peace with the choices I'd made. The life I thought I'd lost had been replaced by something new, something quieter, but no less meaningful. As I sat there, watching the wind rustle the leaves, I realized something. Sometimes, endings weren't failures. They were just the beginning of something different.